A dedicated air hostess survived a catastrophic plane crash in a desolate, frozen valley. What she dragged from the burning wreckage was a powerful Korean mogul, and keeping him alive would change her life forever. The explosion tore through the silence of the Alaskan wilderness at 11:14 p.m., just as Vivian Russo was securing the first-class cabin for an emergency landing. She knew these safety protocols like the back of her hand, had been practicing them for 10 years, ever since she earned her wings with Global Sky. The jagged remains of the aircraft loomed behind her, a skeleton of twisted metal and orange fire that glowed violently against the endless white. It was a scene of destruction that nature was already trying to bury, but you couldn't ignore the silence that followed. Even muffled by the howling wind, the absence of other voices cut through the frozen night like a blade. Vivian stopped mid-step, her heavy boots sliding against the slick, blood-soaked ice. She pulled back her hood, the roar of the fire dying as she strained to hear any sign of life. Nothing. Just the low, hungry groan of metal surrendering to the cold. Maybe she'd imagined the movement in the snow. Maybe her mind was playing tricks after the sheer terror of the descent and the crushing impact of the crash. She started moving again, faster now. She couldn't afford to stay near the wreckage. The fuel tanks had already flared twice, and she knew the fire would erase whatever the crash had spared. Vivian had been written up by the airline before, once for breaking protocol to comfort a terrified child, once for questioning an elite passenger's behavior. One more strike and she'd be grounded for good. And her sister's medical bills were due in 5 days. The thought made her stomach clench. She had exactly $1,847 in her savings, and the next treatment was $1,400. That left almost nothing for the life she was struggling to maintain back home. A groan came again, closer this time, a man's voice raw with pain. Every instinct Vivian had developed growing up in a world that demanded she follow the rules told her to save herself. Don't get involved with whatever secrets were in Seat 1A. Don't be a witness to a disaster that looked less like an accident and more like a hit. She had learned that lesson years ago when she saw power destroy the innocent and spent her life trying to stay invisible. But her feet stopped moving. Her hand was already locking around the arm of the man in the tailored black suit. Power had shaped his secrets, but here he was, helpless beneath the storm. This was not her problem. It was absolutely not her problem. If she dragged him into the white void, she'd be late for a rescue that might never come, and for what? A stranger whose very existence brought a different kind of danger. She should walk away. She should find a way to signal for help and forget she ever saw the diamond ring flashing weakly on his finger. That's what any smart person would do. But Vivian had always been more stubborn than smart. She had inherited her father's hero complex, the man who died running toward danger instead of away from it. "This is insane," she muttered, tightening her grip on his heavy frame. Absolutely insane. But she was already pulling him toward the edge of the valley, away from the fire and into the unforgiving, endless white. The tail section of the Global Sky jet groaned, a metallic shriek that echoed across the valley as the fuselage settled deeper into the permafrost. Vivian Russo didn't look back. She couldn't afford to see the orange fire devouring the only shelter she had known for the last 12 hours. The hunger of the wreckage was literal. The fire was eating the oxygen, the fuel, and the very air she needed to breathe. Every few seconds, a sharp crack like a gunshot rang out, metal snapping under the intense heat and the sudden brutal cooling of the Alaskan night. Her boots sank past her ankles into the drift. With every heave, she felt the dead weight of Roh Seung-Kwon straining her shoulders. He was an anchor in a sea of white. His tailored suit, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now a useless rag of wool and silk, stiffening with ice. She could hear his breathing, a wet, labored rasp that kept rhythm with her own frantic pulse. "Just a little further," she wheezed, the words freezing before they could leave her lips. The wreckage behind her gave one final tectonic heave. A fireball blossomed into the sky, casting a long dancing shadow of Vivian and the man she held onto across the untouched snow. The shockwave hit her back like a physical hand, shoving her to her knees. She shielded Seung-Kwon's head with her own body as debris, shards of insulation and scorched plastic, rained down around them. In the sudden, terrifying brilliance of the explosion, she saw it, the glint of the diamond ring on his finger. It was a cold, hard spark of the world they had left behind, a world where he was a king and she was a servant. But out here the fire didn't care about his billions and the snow didn't care about her flight hours. She forced herself up, her muscles screaming in protest. The fire was dying down now, losing its battle against the Arctic chill, leaving them in a darkness more profound than before. She looked toward the tree line, a jagged black wall against the gray sky. If they stayed here, the wolves or the cold would find them by dawn. She tightened her gloved grip on his arm, her knuckles aching. She was the only thing left in the world that was still warm, and she refused to let the wreckage have him. The orange glow of the dying aircraft faded into a bruised purple twilight, leaving Vivian and Seung-Kwon at the mercy of the white silence. Every step was a calculated battle against the environment. The snow was no longer a soft blanket. It was a hungry, waist-deep weight that fought her for every inch of progress. Vivian's boots slid against the slick, hidden ice beneath the powder, her knees buckling under the combined weight of her own exhaustion and the man she refused to leave behind. The wind had shifted from a howl to a low, rhythmic moan that seemed to mock the cadence of her breath. She pulled him in a jagged line, her gloved fingers locked around his arm with a grip so tight it felt like her own bones might snap. Inch by inch, she dragged him through the drifts, her breath tearing from her chest in sharp, ragged clouds that crystallized in the air. The cold was an invasive force, clawing through her flight attendant layers and settling deep into her ribs, but the heat of her adrenaline kept her moving. Seung-Kwon remained a dead weight, his pale face tilted toward the starless sky as if searching for a mercy that didn't exist in the Arctic. Occasionally, his heels would catch on a buried shard of rock or frozen earth, and Vivian would have to stop, her chest heaving, to readjust her hold. In those brief silences, the isolation felt total. There were no sirens, no voices, and no hum of distant traffic. Only the low, hungry roar of the distant fire and the crunch of her own boots against the crust of the earth. She looked at the diamond ring on his finger, flashing weakly each time it caught the faint light. It was a reminder of the power he held in a world that felt a million miles away. Here the only authority was the storm. She tightened her grip, her knuckles aching against the fabric of his black suit. Fear clawed at her, a persistent whisper telling her to save herself, but she ignored it, focusing only on the next step, then the one after that. The tree line loomed ahead like a wall of dark shadows, promising at least a momentary shield from the wind. She didn't know if they would make it to dawn, but she knew she wouldn't let him go. Ahead of her, the white emptiness stretched on, unforgiving and endless. But Vivian Russo kept pulling, her boots sliding, her spirit refusing to surrender to the silence. The wind transformed into a predatory shriek, whipping the snow into a blinding white curtain that erased the horizon. Vivian's world had shrunk to the few feet of frozen earth in front of her and the heavy, rasping weight of the man she was dragging. Every muscle in her back felt like it was being pulled apart by hot wires, her professional poise finally shattering into raw, desperate survival. The tree line she had fought so hard to reach offered little reprieve. The branches groaned under the weight of the ice, snapping like bone in the darkness. She needed more than just a windbreak, she needed a fortress. Her boots caught on a jagged outcropping of rock and she tumbled forward, her knees hitting the permafrost with a sickening thud. For a moment she stayed there, her forehead pressed against the ice, the cold finally starting to feel like a seductive warmth, a quiet invitation to just stop. But then she felt Seung-Kwon's hand, cold and limp, against her neck. The diamond on his finger caught a stray flicker of moonlight, a spark of artificial light in an unforgiving wilderness. She couldn't let him die here, not after she had already lost her world to the fire behind them. With a guttural cry that was swallowed instantly by the gale, Vivian forced herself up and scanned the rising slope. Hidden behind a screen of twisted pines was a dark fissure in the mountainside. A shallow, narrow cave carved out by centuries of relentless wind. It wasn't a palace, but it was dry, and the stone would hold the heat better than the open tundra. She didn't drag him this time. She hauled him, using the last of her adrenaline to wedge his broad shoulders through the rocky opening. They collapsed together on the floor of the cave, the sudden absence of the wind's roar making her ears ring with a deafening silence. The air inside was stale and smelled of wet earth and ancient stone, but to Vivian, it was the sweetest scent she had ever known. She pressed her back against the cold cave wall, her chest heaving, and pulled Seung-Kwon's head into her lap. Outside, the storm raged on, burying the valley in a fresh shroud of white, but here in the shallow dark they were still breathing. The silence inside the cave was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic wet rasp of Seung-Kwon's breathing and the distant muffled scream of the blizzard outside. Vivian's hands shook as she reached for the small emergency kit she had managed to snag from the galley before jumping. The darkness was absolute, but the metallic scent of blood was a roadmap she knew all too well from her training. She clicked on a penlight, the thin beam cutting through the gloom to reveal the wreckage of the man in her lap. His face was a mask of crimson and ash, a deep laceration cutting across his cheekbone like a signature written in blood. Vivian dipped a piece of sterile gauze into a small container of melted snow and began to wipe away the gore, her movements clinical despite the terror clawing at her ribs. As the layers of red fell away, she saw the true extent of the damage. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and a dark, spreading bruise near his temple suggested a severe concussion. "Stay with me, Seung-Kwon," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. She moved her hands down to his chest, feeling for the jagged unevenness of broken ribs. He groaned, a low, guttural sound of agony that vibrated against her palms, and his good eye fluttered open for a fraction of a second. It was unfocused, a dark void of pain before the heavy lids slid shut again. Vivian worked quickly, binding his chest with a strip of fabric torn from her own uniform, her fingers slick with the blood that seemed to be everywhere. The diamond ring on his finger caught the light of her penlight again, a cold and mocking reminder of the world where this man was a god. Here he was just a collection of fragile bones and failing systems, and she was the only thing keeping the ledger of his life from closing. As she finished cleaning the wound on his face, she noticed a strange, intricate tattoo peeking from beneath his collar, a mark that didn't belong to a suit. She pulled his heavy wool coat tighter around him, trying to trap what little heat remained in his body. She had patched the wound she could see, but the signature of the crash was written deep inside him, and the night had only just begun. The cold within the cave was a living thing, but as the adrenaline began to ebb, a different kind of chill settled over Vivian. She sat back on her heels, her breath hitching as her penlight brushed over the heavy silver ring on Seung-Kwon's hand. Up close, it wasn't just a diamond. The stone was set into a deep, intricate carving of a tiger's head, its eyes made of tiny, piercing rubies that seemed to glow in the artificial light. It was a seal, a mark of ancient, iron-fisted authority that had nothing to do with boardrooms or stock options. Her gaze traveled from the ring to the base of his throat, where the torn collar of his bespoke shirt revealed the edge of a dark tattoo she had glimpsed moments ago. With trembling fingers, she eased the fabric aside. It was a sprawling, masterfully inked dragon, its tail disappearing beneath his shoulder and its claws clutching at his jugular. This was no ordinary corporate mark. It was the signature of the Kim family, the most feared name in the Korean underworld. Vivian's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't just hiding in a cave with a wealthy passenger. She was shielding the ghost of Seoul, a man whose very name was synonymous with a ruthless empire. The realization made the small cave feel even tighter, the air thicker with the scent of his blood and the weight of his secrets. She looked at his pale, aristocratic face, now marred by the violet bruise and the deep cut she had cleaned. He carried the silence of a man who moved mountains with a whisper, but here he was a liability that could get her killed just for being a witness. The plane hadn't just crashed. It had been brought down to erase him, and anyone standing next to him was nothing more than collateral damage. A low moan vibrated from his chest, and his hand, the one wearing the tiger's seal, twitched as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Vivian felt the urge to pull away, to run back into the white void and hope for a different rescue, but she looked into his battered face and saw the raw vulnerability beneath the power. She had saved a monster, but he was her passenger, and in the freezing dark she realized that the secret of who he was had just bound her to him more tightly than any chain. The thin beam of the penlight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the jagged cave walls as Vivian leaned over the man who held the secrets of an empire in his veins. The sub-zero air was so still she could hear the tiny rhythmic clicks of the freezing stones outside, but inside the small fissure, the only sound that mattered was the wet, hitching struggle of Seung-Kwon's lungs. She reached out, her gloved fingers trembling as she brushed a frost-covered lock of dark hair away from his forehead. His skin felt like marble, cold, hard, and dangerously drained of life. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the silence. "Roh Seung-Kwon, do you hear me? You didn't survive 30,000 feet just to let the snow win now." As if answering a summons from a world he wasn't ready to leave, His chest gave a violent tectonic heave. A sharp, guttural gasp tore from his throat, a sound of raw agony that seemed to vibrate through the very floor of the cave. His body jerked, his spine arching off her lap as his lungs fought to pull in the stale, frigid air. Vivian pressed her hands firmly against his shoulders, pinning him down to prevent him from aggravating his broken ribs. "Easy," she urged, her heart hammering against her own ribs like a trapped bird. "Slow breaths. You're safe. You're off the plane." His eyelids fluttered, heavy and dark, before finally snapping open. For a terrifying second, there was no recognition in his gaze, only the glazed, blown-out stare of a predator coming back from the brink of extinction. His good eye was bloodshot and unfocused, darting around the dim stone ceiling as his hand, the one bearing the ruby tiger seal, clenched into a fist, knuckles white and straining. He tried to lunge upward, a silent snarl twisting his split lips, but the pain of his injuries caught him, forcing a strangled cry from his throat. "Don't move," Vivian commanded, her professional air hostess voice cutting through his panic. "You have a concussion and internal bleeding. If you fight me, you'll bleed out before the storm breaks." The authority in her tone seemed to pierce the fog of his delirium. Seung-Kwon's gaze finally locked onto hers, focusing with a sudden, chilling intensity that made her breath hitch. In the weak glow of the penlight, his dark iris looked like polished obsidian. He studied her face, the soot-stained skin, the frost-bitten cheeks, and the stubborn set of her jaw, as if trying to reconcile the image of a servant with the woman who had dragged him through the gates of hell. "Who?" His voice was a ruined rasp, barely more than a ghost of a sound. "Where?" "Vivian Russo. Flight attendant," she said, refusing to blink under his scrutiny. "We're in a cave 3 miles from the wreckage. Everyone else is gone, Seung-Kwon. It's just us." He closed his eyes, a ripple of something that might have been resignation or calculation crossing his battered features. His hand reached up, his fingers brushing the hem of her torn navy blazer with a touch that felt more like an assessment than a plea. He was no longer a mogul or a ghost. He was a man who realized his life was now held in the hands of someone he had never truly looked at until now. He let out a long, shuddering breath that misted between them. "Stayed," he whispered, the realization carrying a weight heavier than the mountain above them. Vivian tightened her grip on his hand, her own warmth the only shield he had left. "I'm not going anywhere. Just breathe." The darkness within the cave was no longer a silent void. It was filled with the fractured, feverish whispers of a man caught between two worlds. Roh Seung-Kwon lay with his head in Vivian's lap, his body twitching as the concussion and internal injuries dragged him into a jagged delirium. The thin beam of the penlight had long since been extinguished to save the battery, leaving them in a cold, absolute blackness where only sound and touch remained. Vivian leaned her back against the weeping stone wall, her arms wrapped around her own chest, trying to share the dwindling remains of her body heat with the man who was supposed to be a ghost. "The jade. It wasn't enough," Seung-Kwon rasped, his voice a dry rattle that seemed to scrape against the silence. His hand, heavy and freezing, fumbled in the dark until his fingers caught the fabric of Vivian's torn blazer. He pulled at her, his strength surprising and desperate. "They think they can bury the tiger in the snow. They think the Kim family forgets. Tell them. Tell the Choi chairman I am still breathing." Vivian reached down, her gloved hand finding his forehead. He was burning up despite the sub-zero air, a terrifying fever taking hold. "Hush," she urged, her voice a soft, steady anchor. "There is no jade here. No chairman. Just the wind and the stone. You need to save your strength." He didn't seem to hear her. He was back in Seoul, or perhaps in the boardroom where the sabotage began. He spoke rapid-fire Korean for several minutes, harsh, commanding tones that softened into a low, grieving moan. "I saw the wire, Hannah," he whispered, his English returning like a confession. "I saw the spark before the engine died. It wasn't an accident. It was a signature. They killed 30 people just to reach me. 30 innocent souls, for one ghost." Vivian felt a cold spike of horror pierce her own exhaustion. She had known the crash felt wrong, but hearing it confirmed in the delirium of a dying mogul made the mountain feel even more like a tomb. She realized then that she wasn't just a survivor. She was a witness to a massacre. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the dark, pressing her cheek against the top of his head. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be," he managed, his grip on her sleeve suddenly tightening as a moment of agonizing clarity pierced through the fever. He turned his head, his breath hot and ragged against her neck. In my world, Vivian, sorry is for the weak. But you are the only truth I have left in this dark. Don't let them find us. If they find us, they won't just kill me. They will erase the woman who dared to keep me alive. He slumped back, the brief surge of energy vanishing as he spiraled back into the shadows of his mind. Vivian sat trembling, the weight of his secrets feeling heavier than the mountain of snow above them. She had saved a king, and in doing so she had marked herself for a war she was never meant to fight. The wind howled with a renewed, banshee-like ferocity, rattling the very bones of the mountain. Inside the narrow fissure, Vivian Russo watched the mouth of the cave with the hypervigilance of a cornered animal. Roh Seung-Kwon had finally succumbed to a heavy, drug-like sleep, his fevered whispers replaced by a terrifyingly shallow silence. She knew the cold was winning. More importantly, she knew the wolves were coming, not the four-legged kind, but the men Seung-Kwon had warned her about in his delirium. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the valley, distinct from the snapping of frozen timber. It was a mechanical sound, a snowmobile engine, distant but closing in. Vivian felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce her exhaustion. If those men reached this slope, they would find the drag marks she hadn't been able to cover. They would find the ghost of Seoul, and they would erase every witness to their crime. She looked at Seung-Kwon's pale, noble face, then at the emergency flare gun she had kept tucked into her waistband. It was a single-shot gamble, a flare meant for a rescue that felt like a fantasy. But in the hands of a woman with nothing left to lose, it was a weapon of misdirection. I'll be back for you, she whispered, though he couldn't hear her. She squeezed his hand one last time, feeling the cold silver of his tiger ring against her palm, and crawled toward the cave entrance. The blizzard hit her like a physical blow, the white-out conditions reducing her world to a blur of gray and shadow. She didn't head down toward the engine sounds, she climbed. She moved laterally across the ridge, her lungs burning, her uniform blazer offering no protection against the needles of ice. When she was nearly half a mile from the cave, she positioned herself behind a jagged spine of rock and aimed the flare gun toward the far side of the valley, away from their hiding place. Please work, she prayed, her finger tightening on the trigger. The flare left the barrel with a violent thump and a trail of magnesium sparks. It arched high into the black sky, a brilliant, bleeding red star that illuminated the jagged peaks for a fleeting, terrifying second. Before the light even died, she heard the roar of the engine's pivot. The hunters had seen the signal. They were racing toward the empty eastern ridge, lured away by the very thing meant to save her. Vivian collapsed back into the snow, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. She had bought them time, but as she began the grueling crawl back to the cave, she realized she had also just told the entire world exactly where they were. The trek back to the cave was a descent into a private, frozen purgatory. Vivian's limbs felt as though they had been replaced by lead, her joints stiffening as the sub-zero air leached the final remnants of warmth from her marrow. Every time she inhaled, the frost-laden wind felt like 1,000 tiny needles piercing her lungs, a sharp reminder that her body was reaching its absolute limit. The adrenaline that had fueled her desperate gamble with the flare gun was gone, leaving behind a hollow, bone-deep exhaustion that made her vision swim with dark, rhythmic spots. She collapsed through the narrow fissure of the cave, her knees hitting the stone with a dull thud she could barely feel. The silence inside was thick, a stark contrast to the predatory howl of the blizzard she had just escaped. Roh Seung-Kwon lay exactly where she had left him, his pale features illuminated only by the faint, ghostly reflection of the snow at the cave's mouth. His breathing had changed. It was no longer a wet rasp but a faint, shallow whistle that terrified her more than the shouting of the hunters. "I'm back," she whispered, but the words were a slurred mess. Her tongue felt thick, her jaw uncooperative. Vivian tried to reach for the emergency kit to check his bandages, but her fingers refused to curl. She stared at her gloved hands, watching them tremble with a violent, uncontrollable rhythm. The frozen fever of late-stage hypothermia was setting in, a dangerous state where the mind begins to slip and the heart falters. She knew the signs from her training, the confusion, the loss of motor skills, and the seductive urge to simply lie down and sleep. With a guttural groan of effort, she dragged herself the last few inches to Seung-Kwon's side. She didn't have the strength to lift his head into her lap this time. Instead, she curled her body against his, tucking her freezing face into the crook of his neck. Even through the layers of his wool coat, she could feel the faint, erratic thrum of his pulse. He was still alive, a stubborn spark in the dark, and that realization was the only thing keeping her from surrendering to the void. Her eyes drifted shut as a strange, deceptive warmth began to spread through her chest. It was the body's final lie, the internal fire that burns right before the end. She tightened her arm around his waist, her grip weakening as her consciousness began to fray. She had led the wolves away, but the cold had followed her back, and as the shadows of the cave closed in, Vivian Russo wondered if she would ever wake up to see the man she had sacrificed everything to save. The stillness of the cave was shattered by the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of approaching engines. Vivian stirred, her consciousness fraying at the edges, the frozen fever, making the world feel like it was viewed through a pane of distorted glass. The warmth she had shared with Roh Seung-Kwon was being sucked away by the renewed draft from the fissure. Below, in the valley, the red flare she had fired earlier had finally sputtered out, but its purpose was served. The hunters had returned to the crash site, realizing they had been lured away by a phantom. A beam of artificial light, sharp and clinical, swept across the mouth of the cave. Vivian pressed her freezing face against the stone, her breath hitching. She could hear the crunch of snow boots, too heavy and deliberate to belong to a rescue team. These were the men Seung-Kwon had warned her about, the ones who would erase the woman who dared to keep him alive. Search the ridgeline, a voice commanded in harsh, clipped Korean. Vivian didn't understand the words, but she recognized the cadence of authority, the same cold, commanding rhythm she had heard in Seung-Kwon's voice, yet stripped of his strange, newfound vulnerability. She looked down at the man in her lap. Seung-Kwon's eyes remained closed, his face a mask of bruised marble, but his hands suddenly twitched, his fingers digging into the fabric of her torn navy blazer. He was awake enough to hear them. He was awake enough to know the wolves had found the door. Through the narrow opening, Vivian saw a figure emerge from the blizzard. He was dressed in high-end tactical gear, a sharp contrast to the industrial decay of a standard recovery crew. On the shoulder of his jacket was a small embroidered patch, a silver hawk diving through a circle of fire. It was the insignia of the Choi organization, the rivals who had been trying to push into Seung-Kwon's territory for months. The lead hunter stopped just yards from the cave, his flashlight illuminating the shallow drag marks Vivian hadn't been able to bury. He knelt, brushing the fresh powder away to reveal the dark, frozen signature of Seung-Kwon's blood. The man looked directly at the fissure, his eyes cold and predatory. He reached for the suppressed pistol at his hip, the metal glinting with a lethal promise. Vivian felt a surge of raw, animal terror. She looked at the emergency kit, then at the flare gun she had reloaded with her last shaking hand. The hunters had arrived to finish the sabotage, and as the shadow of the lead man fell across the cave floor, Vivian Russo realized that the only thing standing between the ghost of Seoul and his executioners was a terrified flight attendant who refused to let her passenger die. The shadow of the lead hunter stretched across the cave floor, a dark, jagged finger pointing toward the truth hidden in the stone. Vivian Russo held her breath, the air in her lungs feeling like shards of glass. She was pressed so tightly against the freezing wall that she could feel the ancient vibrations of the mountain, a low, indifferent hum that seemed to count down the seconds of her life. Beside her, Roh Seung-Kwon was a silent ghost, his fingers still locked with bruising strength around her torn sleeve. He was awake, his one good eye tracking the movement of the light outside with the cold, lethal focus of a man who had played this game 1,000 times, though never while broken and bleeding in the dirt. The hunter stepped closer, the crunch of his tactical boots against the permafrost sounding like bones snapping in the silence. He didn't rush. He moved with the terrifying patience of a predator who knew the prey had nowhere left to run. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness of the fissure again, splashing against the emergency kit and the edge of Vivian's boots. Vivian felt the raw animal urge to scream, to bolt into the blizzard and let the cold take her, but she looked at Seung-Kwon. His jaw was set, a thin line of blood trickling from his split lip, his expression one of iron-willed defiance. He wasn't giving up, and she realized she couldn't either. She reached for the flare gun, her fingers numb and clumsy. It was a pathetic defense against a suppressed pistol, but it was all she had. As the hunter reached for the edge of the rocky opening, Vivian shifted her weight, a small pebble skittering across the floor. The sound was a gunshot in the stillness. The hunter froze, his weapon coming up in a smooth, practiced arc. He leaned in, the silver hawk patch on his shoulder gleaming with a predatory light. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness deeper in the cave, a sound Vivian hadn't made. Seung-Kwon had thrown a small shard of stone into the back of the fissure, the impact mimicking the movement of something much larger and more dangerous. The hunter's flashlight swerved toward the sound, his focus breaking for a fraction of a second. It was the only opening they would get. Vivian didn't think. She acted on the raw instinct of survival she had inherited from a father who ran toward the fire. She lunged forward, not toward the man, but toward the heavy shelf of ice hanging just above the cave's mouth. She slammed the butt of the flare gun against the frozen overhang with every ounce of her remaining strength. The ice groaned, a tectonic shriek of surrendering crystal, before collapsing in a massive white curtain. The hunter cried out, diving backward as a ton of snow and jagged ice buried the entrance, sealing them inside a tomb of their own making. The silence that followed was absolute, the world outside erased. They were trapped, but for the first time since the crash, the wolves were on the other side of the door. The darkness inside the sealed cave was absolute, a heavy, airless silence that pressed against Vivian's eardrums. The ice wall she had created was a temporary reprieve, but it had also turned their sanctuary into a tomb. Beside her, Roh Seung-Kwon was a ghost of a man, his breathing so shallow it barely stirred the frozen air. She reached out in the blackness, her numb fingers finding the cold silver of his tiger ring. It was the only thing that felt real. Vivian leaned her forehead against the icy barrier, her strength finally spent, the frozen fever, whispering that it was time to let go. Then the mountain vibrated, not with the indifferent hum of nature, but with the rhythmic concussive beat of rotors. Vivian, Seung-Kwon rasped, his voice a ghost of a sound in the dark. He wasn't looking at the ice. He was listening to the frequency of the blades. Those are not Choi's wolves. That is the Kim family signature. Heavy lift, twin engine. They found us. The sound grew until the cave floor trembled. Suddenly, a violent explosion of white light and heat shattered the ice wall from the outside. Vivian shielded her eyes as the frozen curtain disintegrated into a million glittering shards. Through the cloud of snow and steam, a team of men in slate-gray tactical gear descended from the sky on fast ropes, their movements a sharp, professional contrast to the chaotic brutality of the saboteurs. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency that made the air hostess realize she had transitioned from a struggle against nature to the center of a private war. The lead man, an older figure with silver-threaded hair and eyes that missed nothing, stepped into the cave. He ignored Vivian entirely, his focus solely on the battered man in her lap. He dropped to one knee, speaking rapid-fire Korean with a tone of deep iron-bound loyalty. "Deong," Seung-Kwon whispered, his hand finally relaxing its grip on Vivian's sleeve. The man Deong finally looked at Vivian. His assessment was cold and clinical, weighing her value in an instant. "You are the one who kept him alive," he said in perfect English, his voice devoid of warmth but heavy with a strange kind of respect. "The Kim family owes you a debt that cannot be measured in currency." As the medics swarmed forward to stabilize Seung-Kwon, they tried to move Vivian aside. But Seung-Kwon's hand shot out, catching her wrist with surprising strength. His dark eyes locked onto hers, the authority of the ghost returning even amidst his agony. "She stays," he commanded. "She is not a witness. She is mine." Vivian felt the world tilt as she was lifted into the thrumming heat of the extraction helicopter. She had saved a king from the snow, and as the frozen valley dropped away beneath them, she realized her old life had been buried in the wreckage. She wasn't just an air hostess anymore. She was an honored guest in a world of silk and shadows, and the rescue was only the beginning of a much more dangerous journey. The transition from the raw, jagged reality of the Alaskan wilderness to the sterile, pressurized cabin of the Kim family's private medical jet felt like a fever dream. Vivian Russo sat in a plush, cream-colored leather seat, her body trembling so violently that the thermal blankets draped over her shoulders rattled like dry leaves. The transition to safety was too fast, too loud, and too warm. The air, recycled and scented with expensive sandalwood, felt thick and artificial compared to the sharp, lethal purity of the mountain air she had breathed for the last 12 hours. Across the aisle, Roh Seung-Kwon was a flurry of clinical motion. Medics in charcoal scrubs worked with a silent, terrifying efficiency, attaching monitors and starting 4 drips that glowed with a pale amber light. His face was still a mask of bruised marble, but under the bright LED lights of the cabin, the signature of his injuries looked even more grotesque. The deep cut on his cheek was a jagged, swollen reminder of the snow. Despite the heavy sedatives they were pumping into his veins, his good eye remained open, a dark, unfocused sliver of obsidian that never left Vivian's face. As the jet leveled out at 40,000 feet, the silver-haired man named Deong approached her. He carried a tray with a bowl of simple broth and a glass of water, setting it on the mahogany table in front of her with a stiff, formal bow. "The boss has a facility in Seoul prepared for your arrival," he said, his voice a low rumble that barely carried over the hum of the engines. "Your apartment in the city has been secured, and your sister's medical expenses have been settled in full. You are no longer a guest of the elements, Miss Russo. You are a guest of the Kim family." Vivian looked down at her hands. They were still stained with Seung-Kwon's blood, the dark crust etched into the lines of her palms. She reached for the glass of water, her fingers brushing against the silk sheets of the medical bed they had offered her. The fabric felt alien, too smooth, too expensive, too far removed from the rebar and concrete of the world she knew. She had spent her life serving people in these seats, invisible and obedient, but as she looked at Seung-Kwon, she realized the invisible lines had been erased. She wasn't just an air hostess who had performed her duty. She was the woman who had dragged a tiger through the snow. As the drugs finally pulled Seung-Kwon under, his hand twitched against the silk, his tiger ring catching the cabin lights in a flash of cold, rubied fire. Vivian closed her eyes, the warmth of the cabin finally beginning to seep into her marrow, knowing that while the snow was behind them, the true danger of the silk sheets was only just beginning. The penthouse in Seoul was a fortress of glass and silence, perched so high above the city that the neon lights of the Gangnam district looked like a distant, flickering fire beneath a sea of clouds. Vivian Russo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, wrapped in a robe of heavy black silk that felt like a second skin. The heat of the room was a constant, curated luxury, yet a phantom chill still seemed to linger in the marrow of her bones, a memory of the Alaskan white that no amount of central heating could erase. Behind her, the soft chime of a sliding door announced his arrival. Roh Seung-Kwon stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. He was dressed in a dark, structured robe, the deep indigo fabric highlighting the paleness of his skin. The jagged signature of the crash, the scar across his cheek, had begun to fade into a thin, silvery line, a permanent mark of the night the world tried to break him. "You aren't sleeping," he said, his voice no longer a ruined rasp but a low, resonant hum that carried the weight of his restored authority. "I was thinking about the snow," Vivian admitted, not turning around. "How it felt like the only real thing in the world. Now being here, it feels like the dream." Seung-Kwon moved to stand beside her, the scent of sandalwood and expensive soap drifting from him. He followed her gaze out toward the horizon. The power that shaped his posture was back, the ghost of Seoul once again in command of his empire, but when he looked at Vivian, the predatory mask slipped. He reached out his hand, still bearing the ruby tiger seal, finding hers on the cold glass. "The snow was the end of one life, Vivian, but it was the beginning of this one," he said, his fingers lacing through hers with a possessive iron-bound strength. "My enemies think they have buried the threat. They don't realize that by trying to kill me, they gave me the only thing I was missing. Someone I can trust without a contract." Vivian looked at their joined hands, her natural skin against the silk and the silver of his world. She thought of the $1,400 medical bill that was no longer a shadow over her life and the sister who was now receiving the best care money could buy. She had started that morning as a woman invisible to the world, just another air hostess serving drinks at 30,000 feet, but she was ending it as the pillar of a new, dangerous alliance. "Neither of us is the same person who got on that plane," she whispered, turning to meet his intense, obsidian gaze. "No," Seung-Kwon agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, the boyish, real smile that only she had seen. "The hostess died in the wreckage and the mogul died in the cave. We are something else now. Something they won't see coming." Outside, the first light of a new dawn began to bleed across the Seoul skyline, And as they stood together in the high, silent dark, Vivian realized that while she had saved his life in the snow, he had given her a world that was wild, uncertain, and absolutely hers. The alliance was sealed, and as they watched the sun rise over the empire they would now navigate together, both knew for certain, nothing would ever be the same.